She had learned, somewhere along the way, to make herself invisible. Not the kind of invisible that people choose. Not the kind that comes from shyness or pride. But the slow, grinding kind that happens when you give yourself away, piece by piece, year after year, until the woman you used to be is so far beneath the surface you are not sure she is still there. Her name was Ruth. Ruth Calloway. 58 years old. A retired schoolteacher. A mother of 3 grown children who called on holidays. A woman who made the best lemon pound cake in her county, who knew every wildflower by name, who had not cried in front of another person in 11 years because she had decided, long ago, that her tears were an inconvenience to others. This is her story. And it begins, like most true stories do, not with anything dramatic. It begins with a Tuesday. Ruth had been retired for 8 months when the loneliness arrived in earnest. She had expected it, in the abstract way you expect winter when summer ends. She had told herself she was prepared. She had made lists, things she would finally do, places she would finally see, hobbies she would finally take up. The list sat in a yellow legal pad on her kitchen counter, items unchecked, edges curling. For 31 years, her days had been shaped by other people's children. She had taught 4th grade at Callaway Creek Elementary. Different school, same last name, a coincidence that had always amused the parents. She had given those children everything she had. Patience, stories, second chances, the specific kind of love that asks nothing back, because children cannot give it. She had been good at it. She had been, her colleagues always said, extraordinary at it. But there is a particular grief that comes when the work that defined you is finished. No one talks about it. No one sends cards. There is a retirement party with a sheet cake and a card signed by 40 people whose handwriting you cannot always identify. And then on Monday morning the alarm does not go off and the house is very, very quiet. Ruth had been divorced for 12 years. Thomas had left on a Saturday in October, and the most honest thing she had ever admitted to herself, only in the dark, was that by the time he left, she had been so depleted by the effort of holding their family together that she had not had the energy to grieve him. She had grieved the idea of him. She had grieved the marriage she had believed they were building. But Thomas himself had been a stranger inside her own house for years before he walked out of it. Her children, Marcus in Denver, Simone in Philadelphia, Caleb who lived 40 minutes away but was consumed by his young family, they loved her. She knew they loved her. But love, she had found, does not always protect you from being alone. By February of that first retirement year, Ruth had developed a habit she was mildly ashamed of. Every morning, she drove to the post office in town and mailed letters she had written the night before. Not emails. Real letters, in envelopes, with stamps. She wrote to former students whose addresses she had tracked down through Christmas cards over the years. She wrote to her college roommate in New Mexico. She wrote to her cousin Dottie in Georgia. The real reason she drove to the post office was not the letters. It was so she would have somewhere to go. The post office shared a parking lot with a small diner called Maple and Main. Ruth had driven past it hundreds of times without stopping. She was not, by nature, a person who ate alone in public. There was something in it that felt too exposed. A woman at a table by herself with nothing to read and no one to talk to, available for pity. But on a Thursday in late February, it was raining hard enough that she had no desire to run back to her car, and the diner's window was fogged with warmth, and something about it just looked like the kind of place where the coffee was hot and no one would bother her. She went in. She sat at a small table near the window and ordered coffee and eggs and toast. And she looked out at the rain on the parking lot and felt, surprisingly, almost all right. She noticed him because he was laughing. Not at anything visible, no phone, no companion. He was a man perhaps a few years older than her, sitting alone at table 7 with a paperback held open by a coffee mug, and he was laughing at something in the book. Quietly, privately, the way people laugh when they forget they are in public. It was one of the most alive sounds Ruth had heard in months. She looked away quickly. She did not want to be caught staring at a stranger's private moment of happiness. But when she was leaving, coat buttoned, umbrella retrieved from beside the door, she walked past his table, and he looked up, and she saw that he had the kind of face that had been through something significant, and come out the other side still open, still willing. Good book, she heard herself say. She surprised herself completely. He held it up. It was a collection of short stories by a writer she recognized. "It's quiet but it's honest," he said. "Best combination." "I taught that writer to my fourth graders once," she said. "The shorter stories. They understood it better than I expected." He looked at her with an expression she could not quite name. "Now that's something," he said. She nodded and pulled her umbrella open and left. She thought about that exchange for 3 days. His name, she eventually learned, was George Alderman. She learned it because she went back to Maple and Maine the following Thursday, and the one after that, telling herself she simply liked the coffee. She was not, she told herself, looking for him. She was just a retired woman who had found a diner she liked. That was all. He was there the second Thursday. He nodded when he saw her. She nodded back and took her same table by the window, and did not look over at table 7 more than twice. He was there the third Thursday too, and this time the diner was more crowded, and there was only one open seat in the whole warm, coffee-smelling room. It was across from him. "Would you mind?" she asked. "Please," he said, and moved his coat from the chair. George Alderman was 62. He had been a civil engineer for 30 years, and had retired the previous spring. His wife, Patricia, had died 4 years ago. Cancer, he said it plainly without flinching, the way people do when they have made peace with the word. He had a son in Atlanta and a daughter who had just had twins in Nashville, which meant he said with a slow smile, now outnumbered by grandchildren. He asked questions the way people rarely do anymore, not to fill space while he waited to talk about himself, but because he actually wanted to know. He asked about her teaching. He asked what it was like to give 31 years to other people's children. He asked what she missed most about the classroom. "The small discoveries," she said, without having to think about it. "That moment when a child understands something for the first time, and you can see it happen in their face. There's nothing like it." "I imagine not," he said. They sat for 2 hours. Ruth looked up at the clock on the diner wall, and felt a small shock at how much time had passed, and underneath the shock, something warmer and more dangerous. She drove home telling herself it was just a pleasant conversation. She was good at telling herself things. But that night she sat at her kitchen table with the yellow legal pad, and she did not write a letter. She sat for a long time in the quiet, and for the first time in a very long while, the quiet did not feel entirely like absence. Spring came in slow and tentative, the way it does in that part of the country, and Ruth and George began meeting at Maple and Maine on Thursdays with a casualness that felt deliberate on both their parts. She told Simone about him, once during a phone call in April. "Mom," Simone said, with a warmth that had an edge of caution in it, "just be careful." Ruth had said, "Of course," and moved the conversation elsewhere. But the word stayed with her. Careful. She understood what Simone meant. She had been burned before, and not only by Thomas. She had been burned by trusting too much, giving too much, assuming that love was a contract where both parties held their end. She had learned, slowly and at great cost, that love without self-preservation is not love. It is a kind of slow disappearing act. She liked George. She liked him more each Thursday. And so she began carefully and almost unconsciously to pull back. She kept things light. She answered his questions but did not ask many in return. She laughed easily and said little of real weight. She was pleasant and present and entirely unavailable in the way that matters. George noticed. She could see it in the way his eyes held hers a moment longer than conversation required. A slight, searching quality. But he did not push. He simply kept showing up on Thursdays and being exactly who he was and not asking her to be anything she was not ready to be. It was, she would think later, one of the most loving things anyone had ever done for her. Then one Thursday in May, Ruth arrived at Maple and Maine and George was not there. She sat at her table by the window and drank her coffee slowly, watching the door. He was sometimes a few minutes late. Then 15 minutes. Then half an hour. She left. She told herself it was nothing. People had lives. She did not hear from him for 2 weeks. She did not have his number. They had never exchanged numbers. They were 2 people who met at a diner on Thursdays, and that was all. And she had made sure of that deliberately. In those 2 weeks, Ruth understood something about herself that she had been avoiding. She had spent 12 years teaching herself not to need anyone too much. And she had gotten so good at it that she had almost convinced herself she had succeeded. She had not succeeded. She had just gotten very good at being alone. He came back on a Thursday in early June. He was thinner. There were shadows under his eyes that had not been there before. He came in and scanned the room, and when he saw her at the window table, something in his whole posture shifted, softened. She watched him walk over. She watched him sit down. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "You don't owe me anything," she said automatically. He looked at her for a moment. "Ruth," he said gently. "I think you say that to everyone." She opened her mouth and closed it again. "My son called me," George said. His wife left. Suddenly, out of nowhere, or at least that's how it looked from the outside. He had 2 small children and no idea how to be alone with them, and he was not all right. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "I went to Atlanta for 3 weeks. I slept on his couch and made breakfast and took the kids to the park and we talked, really talked, for the first time in maybe 10 years. It was hard. It was also," he paused. "It was important." "Is he okay?" Ruth asked. "Better. Not fixed. But better." George looked at her. "I didn't have your number. I thought about that every day. I thought, she's going to think I just disappeared. I thought maybe you just had somewhere else to be," Ruth said carefully. "Ruth." His voice was quiet and direct and kind. "I don't have anywhere else. I'd rather be on Thursdays." The diner was warm around them. Outside, the morning was moving into full June light, the kind that makes everything look like it is just beginning. She had spent 2 weeks composing a letter in her head. Not a letter she ever intended to send, just the old habit, the way she worked through things. And in that letter she had said all the things she never said out loud. That she was afraid of needing someone again. That she was afraid of becoming small again. That she was afraid that whatever this was would turn into something that asked her to disappear. The way everything in her life had eventually asked her to disappear. She had not sent the letter. Of course she had not sent it. But sitting across from George in the warm diner, she found, to her complete surprise, that she was about to say it out loud instead. "I'm not good at this," she said. "I don't mean conversation. I mean," she stopped. "Tried again. I have spent a long time making sure I didn't need anyone too much. Because every time I did, I ended up carrying more than my share. And I got very used to that. And I don't know how to do it differently." George was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "I've been watching you keep a careful distance for 3 months. Does that bother you?" "No," he said. "Because I understand it. And because," he looked at her steadily, "I'm not in a hurry. And I'm not going to ask you to carry anything. If something is too heavy, you tell me and we put it down. That's the only rule I know that works." Ruth looked at this man across the table. This quiet, patient man who had gone to his son's couch for 3 weeks without fanfare, who had wanted to leave her a message and had no way to do it, who had noticed her careful distance and had not flinched from it. "George," she said, "can I have your number?" He smiled then. A full, uncomplicated smile. "I was hoping you'd ask," he said. What came next was not a fairy tale. Ruth would not have wanted a fairy tale. Fairy tales were for people who had not yet learned what it costs to build something real. What came next was slow and honest, and full of the specific complications that come when 2 people in their late 50s try to make room for each other in lives that have been organized around their own absence. She met his daughter in Nashville that summer, a kind and watchful woman named Cora who looked at Ruth with cautious eyes, and by the end of the weekend was asking for her lemon pound cake recipe. She met his grandchildren, the twins, 17 months old and entirely indifferent to the significance of the occasion, which Ruth found enormously relieving. George drove 4 hours to sit in the back row when Caleb's daughter, Ruth's granddaughter, Nora, was baptized in September. He had not been asked. Ruth had mentioned it in passing. He had written it down. Caleb found him afterward. "You're the man from the diner," he said, because Ruth had told that story once, slightly edited. "I am," George said. Caleb looked at his mother standing a few feet away, holding baby Nora, laughing at something her sister-in-law had said. He looked back at George. "She's happy," he said, quietly, like it was information he was still processing. "She looks actually happy." She's extraordinary, George said simply. Caleb pressed his lips together and nodded and said, "Thank you for coming." Ruth did not know about this exchange until George told her in the car on the way home. She was quiet for a long time. The highway moved past in the dark. "He said that," she finally asked. "He did," Ruth said. And then, after another mile, "I haven't known what to do with that. Being someone's happy, I mean. It used to feel selfish." "I know," George said. "What does it feel like now?" Ruth looked out the window at the dark fields passing. She thought about 31 years of other people's children. She thought about the yellow legal pad and the unchecked lists and the post office mornings that were really just reasons to leave the house. She thought about the woman she had been slowly, quietly burying, piece by piece, year after year. "It feels like something I maybe should have tried sooner," she said. George reached across and took her hand. He did not say anything. He did not need to. The highway continued. The dark was full of stars. The following February, Ruth started writing again. Not letters this time. She had been telling stories her whole life, to children in classrooms in the careful quiet of her own kitchen. And something in her had decided, at 59 years old, that it was time to put them somewhere real. She wrote about teaching. She wrote about the small moments that nobody saw. The child who stopped stuttering in April of 3rd grade. The girl who read her first chapter book out loud to the class in a voice that shook and held. She wrote about what it means to love people who will not remember you the way you remember them. And to love them anyway, completely, without condition. George read every word she wrote. He sat at her kitchen table on Sunday mornings with coffee and her pages, and a pen he never used because he did not want to mark them up, just to hold them. "These are good, Ruth," he said one Sunday, setting the pages down. "You're biased," she said. "Completely," he agreed. "They're still good." Simone called one evening, and Ruth was in the middle of laughing at something George had said, and she could hear, in the slight pause before her daughter spoke, the same thing Caleb had recognized. The sound of a mother who had come back to herself. "Mom," Simone said, "you sound good." "I am good," Ruth said. And the extraordinary thing, the thing that sat with her long after she hung up the phone, was that she meant it without qualification. Without the small asterisk she had attached to that word for years. Without the silent footnote that said, "Mostly, except for this, except for that, except for the parts of me I gave away and cannot find." Just good. Just here. Just herself. The yellow legal pad was still on the kitchen counter. Some of the items were checked now. Not all of them. She had stopped believing that the list was the point. On a Thursday afternoon in March, 1 year, almost exactly, from the Thursday she had walked into Maple and Maine to get out of the rain, Ruth made a lemon pound cake and brought it to the diner. She gave it to Joanne, the waitress who had poured her coffee every week for a year, and always left the cup a little fuller than asked. Joanne looked at the cake, and then at Ruth with an expression of uncomplicated delight. "What's this for?" she asked. Ruth thought about it for a moment. "Just because," she said. "Just because it's Thursday and the coffee is good and some things deserve to be celebrated even when they're ordinary." Joanne laughed and set the cake behind the counter, and refilled Ruth's cup without being asked. And Ruth sat at her table by the window and waited for George. And the morning light came through the glass and everything was quiet and warm and exactly enough. Exactly enough. That is what love looks like, when it is the real kind. Not the kind that arrives like a storm, but the kind that arrives like February light, slowly, gently, without announcement. The kind that sits across from you at a diner table and says, "I don't have anywhere else I'd rather be." The kind that gives without a ledger, without a clock, without ever once asking, "What do I get in return?"